All right, well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Rachel Owen. I'm the director of MOST Policy Initiative. I'm just going to introduce kind of what this briefing is in our organization real quick and then turn it over to our panelists. Let me change the view here. Okay, so MOST Policy Initiative. So we are a nonprofit based in Jefferson City, Missouri. We aim to improve the health, sustainability and economic growth of people and places in Missouri by connecting science and policy at the state level. The primary way that we do that is that we have a fellows program where we place postdoctoral STEM professionals down at the Capitol in Jefferson City, and they serve as informal science advisors to our General Assembly. So they answer questions related to pending legislation. They answer questions that legislators might be getting from constituents. And then we also get asked to share interesting science and information that's not necessarily at the top of their minds right now. And that's where we developed this briefing series, the SciTech briefing series, to bring in work that's being done around the state that is really important for the people of Missouri, but is maybe not getting any attention right now in Jefferson City. So this morning, I'm really excited to be able to toss it over to our first education-related SciTech briefing. And before I do that, I do want to just mention a couple housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout the presentations, feel free to type those into chat or Q&A. We can see both, and our panelists will be able to respond either way. We will go ahead and go through all three presentations before we take questions, but our panelists and experts might be able to ask or answer your questions in the chat if you ask them along the way. So feel free to drop those questions in there anytime. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Brittany Whitley to introduce our panelists. Dr. Whitley is our fellow who is covering education and workforce development. She moved to Missouri fresh last fall and has done an excellent job learning the education landscape in the state, and has done a lot of work publishing science notes related to a lot of different topics on education that are really, really important for students around the state, particularly in the K-12 education space. And this panel was Brittany's idea, and so I'll go ahead and let her introduce a little bit more about why she chose this topic and introduce our panelists.
All right, thanks so much, Rachel, and thank you all for being here this morning. I know it's a little early, but we're really excited to have this research briefing today with three researchers from the University of Missouri in Columbia. So we have Dr. Gurantz, Dr. Kurz, and Dr. Williams with us this morning. Again, really thanks to all of our panelists. I think this is going to be a great discussion this morning. Like you probably saw when you were registering, we're going to be talking today about college access and completion, and particularly how college access, what some of the barriers and opportunities are for college access and completion for historically underserved populations. And so we're talking here about low-income students, students of color, any other minoritized group that traditionally has maybe problems accessing or completing college education due to kind of some systemic barriers that might exist. And so I'm not going to talk too much about the issues today. I'm going to leave that to our experts. I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about each of them before they talk. Our first speaker this morning is going to be Dr. Oded Gurantz. He is an assistant professor in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And he's also a Spencer postdoctoral fellow for the National Academy of Education. And Dr. Gurantz, you can go ahead and share your screen whenever you're able. Really excited to learn from him this morning. The way we kind of have these talks structured is thinking about kind of pre-college behaviors, financial college, and then kind of non-financial access and barriers. And so with that, I will turn it right over to Dr. Gurantz with his talk about preparing for the transition to college. Thanks so much.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you so much, and really appreciate being on the panel today. I think all three of the presenters have lots of experience that span across. We created some sort of boundaries for ourselves in terms of what we're going to talk about, but just to be clear, I think all of us could add a lot to this discussion. So the way that I've decided to frame this, because it's a really short presentation, is thinking a little bit about preparing for the transition to college. And sometimes we think about it as three buckets: the sort of academic preparation, financial preparation, and then what I think of as administrative preparation. And I'm really going to talk about the first and the third briefly today, and not touch about financial as much, because I think Dr. Kurz will be focusing a little bit more on that aspect of it. One of the things that we know, I'm not going to belabor it, is that academics is a strong predictor of later success. So students who do strong in high school do well in college on average. But academics is strongly correlated with a bunch of other things that are related to student backgrounds, such as family income, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I'm going to try to do here is briefly talk a little bit about some studies that are based on causal research design. So these are things where I'm going to argue that they're not about correlations, but they're really like something causes something else. But of course, I'm not going to talk about actual research designs in the 10 minutes. So you can take my word for it or not. But I've tried to include a lot of links in the context of the presentation. So if you're interested in learning more later, you can follow any of these links, and most of them should be publicly available documents. So one of the things that we know is that there's a lot of we're learning is that there's clearly long-term benefits to participating in a strong academic curriculum in high school. So in my own work, I've looked at things like taking advanced placement courses and finding that students who earn credit in advanced placement shorten their time to degree. There's a lot of cost savings associated with that. It helps students invest more deeply in their college major. So in some work I've done, we found that females in particular who take AP STEM courses in high school do actually much better in their college majors, not just, let's say, majoring more in biology, but actually doing better in their biology courses, taking higher level biology courses as a result. And so we know there's really increases in sort of long-term outcomes as a result from stronger academic curriculum. People have studied this in a variety of different ways. Now, one critic might say this is based on old data. So, you know, what some changes we did in the 1980s may be less relevant to changes that we're trying to propose nowadays. That's always a challenge when trying to think about long-term outcomes in research, but there's just a lot of evidence saying participating in a strong academic curriculum really matters. And that we need students to show up to college sort of ready for that level of curriculum. So a lot of colleges try to help students through what they call remedial coursework. So they might show up to college and not be ready for college level coursework. So they take something a little bit below that to try to get back on track. And there's very unfortunate, like pretty disappointing evidence that these remedial courses help students. And so we want to know that students are actually going to kind of show up to college ready. So rather than just sort of diagnosing the problem, and again, there's 8,000 million things we could talk about this space, I'm just going to give examples of a few different kinds of what we think of as like interventions that people are engaging in, or high schools are engaging in nationwide, that seem to be pretty effective at trying to help students show up to college successfully. So one is a lot of these dual enrollment opportunities. So these take a lot of different forms. And you'd have to kind of read about each one specifically to understand the nuances. But one is simply actually having high school students participate in sort of higher level courses. It can be through something like AP, or through, like, for instance, co-developed courses where the high school and the community college often come together to develop things in tandem. So there's better alignment between the high school curriculum and the college curriculum. So a lot of students are in high school, they take what they think is algebra or a higher level English or some class, a writing class, and they find that they come to college that the curriculum is not well aligned, and the college instructor thinks they're not ready, even though they're sort of meeting all the requirements that they needed to in high school. So this is one way that people do it. There's much more intensive kinds of services that people are experimenting with. So for about a good 20 years now, people have been doing what's called early college high schools, which are much more intensive supports for college going. So these are sort of high schools that have a different curriculum. They have a higher level of student supports. They're often co-located on the college campus. And these have been found to have really large cost benefit ratios. So one of the things that happens in these early college high schools is the goal is to actually have students graduate high school, but to do so having taken enough courses to either already earn an associate's degree or make really strong progress towards a bachelor's degree. And again, when I say these have been found to have really positive benefits, these are examples where we have randomized control trials where these things are oversubscribed, and we put some students into these programs and they do much better than the control group. A lot of career and tech activities, these sort of fell out of favor for a while, but have actually been making a pretty strong comeback, especially when you have these sort of more in-depth career-oriented courses, these opportunities for apprenticeships. CTE activities have been found to be pretty positive, much more for males than for females, at least based on the limited evidence that we have, but especially when there's deeper studies. So sort of dabbling in one or two courses doesn't seem to benefit students so much, but actually taking a much longer set of courses that really develop their knowledge has been helpful. But not everything is positive. So there's been some recent attempts to, for instance, add new advanced placement courses into college. There's very little evidence that, for instance, just dropping in and sprinkling a few AP courses is really changing student trajectories. It seems like you need a much more intentional approach. And there's also an open question on the best way to assign seats to promote equity into these kinds of programs. So some of these, particularly early career high schools, have been really focused on serving historically disadvantaged groups. But we know that there's still inequity in who participates in these programs, who's aware of it. High school students, we know, are very responsive to information. There's actually a lot of, they don't know nearly enough about what it means to select across different high schools. And when we give students information, they do respond to it. We do know that there's a lot of inequity in how we assign students, especially when things are based on, for instance, like teacher recommendations. So when we look at things like gifted education, there's been some recent work on advanced placement as well. When we give counselors, teachers, parents a lot of discretion in the process, that increases the amount of inequality. And when we have more universal systems, we tend to, on average, have a better representation, though still by no means perfect. So a lot of questions about how we slot these programs. I'm going to speed it up. So in terms of administrative preparation, I think one thing to think about is we tend to think of students as being historically wanting to go to college if like they see the cost as outweighing the benefits. But we know there's a lot of reasons students don't make decisions that way, students and families. There's a lot of cognitive factors that make it really difficult. There's so much going on in people's lives, a lot of lack of information, lack of time to devote to these kinds of things. And so the key strategies to improve preparation, the administrative part of college, is keeping things simple, easy, and making reminders really often for the students in these families. So people benefit, there's so many steps to optimizing what we think of as college access, right? You have to take college entrance exams, think about every college that's available to you, which ones you want to go to, learn these college applications, these college application platforms, apply for financial aid such as the FAFSA or state aid programs, save the money for the application fees. And we know that missing any of these steps, and there's so many of them, could actually negatively impact whether a student goes to college or not. So people benefit from regular reminders to complete these tasks, but more information is not necessarily the solution. I think the easy cop-out that people kind of point to is if we just give students or families more information about what it means to go to college, they're going to make a better choice. And actually what we need to do is really think about simplified messaging. So some of the most positive impacts we see are things like promise programs or sort of for the free college movement. And some of this is just tuition matters, but a large part of this is the messaging of you can go to college and college is going to be free for you is actually a really effective message and really does move families to think that college is something that they're going to be capable of handling. I'm going to give an example, but I feel like I might be talking a little long. So let me just give a few different kinds of things that people are doing to help this college going process. So one thing is trying to overcome sort of inertia, which we all suffer, right? Think about, we all know when tax day is and you'd want to do it well in advance of April 15th, but you tend not to. So there's always inertia or confusion. And a lot of this can be resolved through direct assistance. So one thing that people do is they move a lot more tasks into the high school. So rather than requiring students to sign up for a SAT or ACT and take it on the weekend or figure out how to complete the FAFSA on their own, they bring those skills into the high school, and that's been shown to make it much better for the college going transition. College advising in general is a more expensive intervention, but there's a lot of evidence that sort of one-on-one college advising, whether in person or even virtual, can help move students into sort of more selective or better colleges. And there's a big issue of the summer before college. So we tend to think of applying happening in 12th grade, but there's so many barriers that students face in the summer, verification reports, lots of different sort of last minute administrative barriers that lead to what we call summer melt. And this is often a period where, because they're not in high school, they don't have the supports that they might be able to find at that local level. And so colleges are experimenting with different ways to try to help prevent melt. So I gave an example of Georgia State using some artificial intelligence in the chatbot to try to smooth that transition for students who have really common questions. And then one thing is that even small financial barriers often prevent students from participating in needed tasks. So even taking an exam or applying to multiple colleges or sending your ACT scores to multiple colleges often has small financial costs, and actually removing that tends to get students to participate more significantly in the process. One key thing we're learning is that you really want to try to create what we think of as like opt-out policies over opt-in. So rather than requiring students to affirmatively opt into something, you want to try to kind of slot them into things when it's morally ethical and then have them opt out. So there's really good examples, for instance, when you go to college, you have to opt into taking a placement exam and then choose a course. And when we get students to opt out, we rely on their high school coursework and slot them into essentially higher level courses than they might receive from taking an entrance exam. It actually seems to speed the process along for them. We see similar examples with taking out student loans. For good reasons, students are quite fearful of taking out student loans. And there's really good evidence that when you kind of push them into doing that, their academics improve as a result. One thing I do a lot of work with sort of what we think of as non-traditional students. It's much easier to substantially improve the behaviors of younger students. So you really want to work with these high school students effectively, because once they sort of fall off track, for lack of a better word, a lot of them are going to come back and succeed, but it's just a much harder road. So trying to get students through that process earlier is something that's really, really important. And then just want to re-highlight that due to COVID, many students have disengaged. There's been an incredible decline in freshman enrollment. And so we're going to have to do a lot of work to try to get these off-track students back on track. I was trying to look at the time, but so just a few last-minute recommendations. Successful states have gotten better data to reach out to students earlier and more often to make sure they stay on track, have simplified their messaging, particularly around finances. They've experimented with incentives, whether monetary or non-monetary, like recognizing certain schools or students to try to improve the level that they're engaging in these activities. Have tried to streamline the application process. Particularly Texas has been successful in having a centralized portal for all of their colleges, and then you have a much better data about where students fall off in the process, and trying to provide consistent support to students, because we know there's disproportionate access to supports across high schools. So I will stop there.
All right, have to unmute. Thanks so much, Dr. Gurantz. That was great, and I'm sure there's going to be several questions that we'll get to at the end of these talks. We're going to go right into our next speaker, Dr. Bradley Kurz. So Dr. Kurz is an associate professor of higher education policy at the University of Missouri in Columbia in the Education Leadership and Policy Analysis Department. He's also the director for the Missouri statewide cooperative EdD program. And today he's going to talk with us about research findings for Missouri financial aid programs. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Kurz.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me all right? Great. I'm going to talk a little bit about research that I've been conducting over the past few years and in consultation with some of our graduate students, looking specifically at the effects of the financial aid programs in Missouri. And so I'm going to quickly just talk about sort of research questions and findings and paying attention to sort of some important inequities that we have seen in the effects of these programs as we look out. So we've been doing a lot of work on the Bright Flight program. I'll talk quickly about some inequities in eligibility for the Bright Flight program, particularly due to the ability to retake the ACT. We'll look at the effect of the Bright Flight program on choosing and eventually graduating with a STEM major, and looking at the effect on future employment in Missouri. So does the Bright Flight program encourage students, high school graduates from Missouri, to work in Missouri 8 years later? We've done work on the A+ scholarship program, and I'll share some work that we've seen on the effect on overall college enrollment, but with paying attention by where they went, how it changed enrollments across the 2-year and 4-year sectors. And then some work on Access Missouri, where we're investigating what happens to these low income students when they lose the Missouri Access due to the GPA retention requirements after their first or second year. So the first question we're just sort of really recently asking is sort of, how does the ability to retake the ACT affect equity and Bright Flight eligibility? So Bright Flight is the state's merit-based financial aid program aimed at sort of very high ability students based on ACT scores. And you qualify for it at the time we investigated by scoring a 30. Now it's currently a 31 on the ACT, but it's really aimed at the top 3 to 5% of students. And we wanted to sort of know, one, we know merit aid has pretty strong inequities across both income and race. That's been demonstrated across the country consistently across years. Almost every single program shows very large inequities. But we were interested in sort of this ability to continue to retake the ACT until you sort of qualify for it, and how that, whether that helps the underrepresented students sort of even the playing field, or is it sort of making it worse? And so this is ACT distributions by income. The darkest line here is low income. The highest line is going to be high income students. And what we see is we have pretty normal distribution. The higher your income, the distribution shifts to the right. This is for students from Missouri, high school graduates from Missouri, and this is pretty typical of what we would expect to see. The second one down here actually shows that what happens when you allow the students, and we look at their highest ACT. And so this allows them to retake it to earn it. And we see really strong jump right here at the Bright Flight eligibility. So there's a really strong incentive for these students to continue to retake their ACT until they achieve this grant, because they can get up to $2,000. But what's really happening is we see a small bump in the low income students. So there are more low income students qualifying it because they're able to retake their ACT. But we actually see that the students that are really benefiting from that policy are high income students. And we see this very large change in the distribution. And we actually see that the equity gap across both low and high income students increases by about 300%. So that's sort of the change in the relative proportion of Bright Flight eligible students to those students that actually took the test. That this gap goes from a 2 to a 6% percentage point gap. And so it's a really large change in being Bright Flight eligible. And it comes through both through increased retaking, the number of times these students are taking it, and there's a cost to every time you retake it, and two, they're actually able to increase their score at larger amounts relative to the low income students. These graphs almost perfectly replicate when we change it to looking at sort of traditionally represented students, white students and Asian American students versus underrepresented students in Missouri. That's primarily African American students. And we see that gap is almost exactly the same. There's this large change in the equity gap increasing. And so the clause sort of takes an inequitable policy in Bright Flight and makes it more inequitable. We've investigated, this is coming out of the dissertation of one of my students, sort of looking at, okay, does receiving Bright Flight change sort of major choice? Does it help students choose into STEM majors? And the idea being, maybe if you lower the cost, you give them more chance to sort of to study, to invest more time in their education, and they're more willing to take on majors that have higher GPA standards and some more expectations. And what we find is that across the board, just receiving Bright Flight, on average, there was no change in the overall likelihood of becoming a STEM graduate, is what I'm showing here. But there's actually some pretty interesting changes across gender. That receiving the Bright Flight, this is the probability of students receiving or graduating with a STEM degree. The 0 shows receiving the Bright Flight, so everyone to the right received it, everyone to the left didn't. We get a sort of increase in the likelihood of STEM graduates from the female population, and a pretty large actually decrease in the male population. So there's something going on that's sort of changing in how students are responding to receiving the Bright Flight and changing their sort of choices of major. And we think there's sort of some interesting things going on there, but we're sort of really continuing to unpack this to sort of understand why this may occur. Across the board, on average, there was no change, but there are some interesting differences across gender. We've then looked at sort of future employment. So does a student that graduated from Missouri in high school, how likely were they to be employed in Missouri and paying into the unemployment insurance system 8 years after graduation? Again, looking at the difference across everyone to the right received Bright Flight, everyone to the left didn't receive Bright Flight. And in this study, we sort of found, yes, that receiving the Bright Flight increased the likelihood of being employed in Missouri 8 years later by about 4.3 percentage points. It's about a 10% increase. That overall effect, even though it's sort of a positive effect, it's not large given sort of the relative investment in this program. And I think part of it is that this should probably be larger, but the Bright Flight's a relatively small award for high ability students. And those students often have lots of different sort of options. But we do see that it has encouraged more students to be employed in Missouri post 8 years, so giving them a chance to sort of finish their education. We've looked at the A+ scholarship program to sort of understand when schools become an A+ school, what happens to their high school graduates. And broadly, we found that, yes, when a school becomes A+, the percentage of their students that go on to college increases overall by about 3%. But what we see a very large increase in the 2-year population by about 31%, and a subsequent decline in the 4-year enrollment by about 11%. And this sort of mimics the A+ program, provides tuition to attend 2-year colleges and technical colleges in the state. And so you're changing the relative prices. But we see that sort of there is a small increase overall attainment, but it is sort of really encouraging these students to sort of change their college choice. And so it calls into question sort of this, because the A+ program sort of only targets the 2-year colleges, there's sort of a democratization effect of more students going, but there appears to be a diversion effect of changing their sort of choices. And this is as those schools became A+ eligible, but it is effective at sort of changing decisions. And so students are definitely responding to the A+ program. And I think the A+ program has some of the strengths that Dr. Gurantz talked about, that it tells them up front, like, you can get paid to go to college. It's sort of a free college program for 2-year colleges, and sort of before we truly had free college. And so it has some really strong attributes, and we see that coming through with the changes in enrollments. Our most surprising finding at this point that we're really trying to unpack, this is sort of very early, is sort of what happens. So all of the state financial aid programs have a requirement that for renewal from year to year, you have to have a 2.5 college GPA. You have to meet sort of academic progress, but you have to have a 2.5 college GPA. That bothers me in the sense that you're potentially taking financial aid away from a student that's got a 2.5 G. They're moving towards graduation, and you're sort of removing this financial aid award from them when they're making progress towards this degree. And so we wanted to investigate what happens to the students that lose that. And so we took the population of Access Missouri, the needs-based grant in Missouri, and one that said, what happens when you lose this award? $1,200, $1,500. And what we actually find is that in looking at retention rates, that when those students lose that award between their first and second year or second and third year, we find no change in their likelihood to be retained within their same institution or across Missouri. And so we see these sort of retention rates increase quite substantially, especially up to 2.0, which is sort of the standard where most schools are going to put you on probation and you may lose federal financial aid. But we actually see that the sort of the retention rate, once you get past that sort of threshold of making progress towards your degree, remains pretty steady across this threshold for the financial aid award, even being retained within Missouri public higher education. That's very similar. And so very surprising. We've been talking with financial aid administrators, and we think that sort of financial aid packages adjust quite a bit around that, or that once these students have started moving and making progress towards their education, losing the $1,000 hasn't changed their education decision, but it's likely then we're investigating GPA. It's likely affecting, one, their overall debt levels they're going to have when they finish education, and it may affect their sort of performance in subsequent years. So broadly, those are some of the studies that we've been working on or are currently working on, sort of lessons broadly from our research, but also integrating what we know about other financial aid research being specific to Missouri. Broadly, I say the Missouri Scholarship Grant Award amounts may not be enough to greatly impact student decisions. So we kind of have 3 programs that all have sort of smallish awards. A+ has a pretty large award for going to the 2-year sector, but the Bright Flight's $2,000 may not be impactful for these sort of very high ability students. And Missouri Access Missouri is sort of adding on to the Pell Grant. We see the enrollment and employment effects of Bright Flight are small. Bright Flight's been shown not to change enrollment rates very much at all. And retention not affected by loss of needs-based grant sort of gives me some information that these awards may be just too small to truly be making differences in the behaviors, and they need to be sort of increased. Second one is that scholarships should be stackable and not first, what we call a first dollar. A+ and Access Missouri sort of counteract. You can't sort of like add them together to pay for anything beyond tuition. And so if you get A+ and Access Missouri, you're really just getting one. And so that's sort of limiting sort of the purchasing ability of these low income students to choose schools, but also to pay for the things past tuition. And I think those scholarship programs can be more effective by allowing students to use dollars on each side. And then Bright Flight as a merit-based program is extremely inequitable across income and race ethnicity lines. And some of the policies actually make it more inequitable. And so all merit aid programs are, but the high threshold of ability and the fact that it's directly tied to ACT does make the Bright Flight sort of very inequitable and sort of adding to inequities in the ability, maybe not to access college because those students are likely to go, but to be able to sort of afford it and to sort of reduce debt on the backside. As sort of just a quick overview of sort of some of the research that we're doing at the University of Missouri, including me and many of my grad students and graduates. And so if you have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I'd like to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kurz. I'm sure we'll have several questions after, and appreciate you sharing your information there. Our last speaker today is going to be Dr. Michael Stephen Williams. So Dr. Williams is also, he's an assistant professor also in the Education Leadership and Policy Analysis Department at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And today he's going to be talking with us about supporting minoritized student success through mentoring and belonging. So I'll turn it right over to you, Dr. Williams. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So this is interesting because we had a couple of conversations about what everybody was going to present on, and I feel like we ended up being sequenced perfectly. And so a big part of my research program is really related to retention and persistence in college. And two of the key levers to me are related to interpersonal relationships. And while my work focuses on minoritized student populations, particularly some of the ones that our previous two presenters talked about a little bit in their work along the traditional lines, I want to talk a little bit about two of the constructs that I spend most of my time with, which are really mentoring and belonging. And so one of the things that I do to contextualize this is to help people think about the role of interpersonal relationships in all learning. And because learning is socially situated from birth, and right now I'm on paternity leave, the infant that you see is 5 months old right now, and usually in my lap for things like this. But one of the benefits of presenting so early in the morning is that she's still asleep. And part of the disconnect that we find a lot of times in college is that we don't have the same fervor and excitement for the growth and development of our students as we do when they're younger. So when a child is a baby, you're excited about everything they do, like, oh, you're drooling, oh, you found your feet. When your daughter's in second grade, like mine is, you're excited when they're reading and they show an interest in developing deeper scientific habits. My son is in fourth grade. He's now doing spelling tests. And anytime that he gets 100, we're having small celebrations. I think part of the issue that we find a lot of times is some of that excitement and some of that sense of connection that we develop at younger ages are things that don't really continue as students begin the transition from high school to college, and they're in college and make the transition from college to career. So for me, mentoring is this really multifaceted construct, and because of differences in how people define it, it can often be difficult to say that we're necessarily studying the same thing. So I share my favorite personal definition of mentoring here up front. And so W. Brad Johnson is a professor that has deep experience in mentoring. He works at the U.S. military academies, and part of the framing that I like from Johnson is just the explication of all the different roles that a mentor really has. So this idea of being a guide, a teacher, a role model, a sponsor, providing knowledge, advice, counsel. This role is really complex, and it's one that I have become more and more convinced through my own work. And just to share, I didn't frame it in the same way as some of our other presenters because I love the way that they connected to their scholarship, but my scholarship studies mentoring and belonging at all levels of the university. So we're engaged in some work with college outreach and academic support programs. We're studying summer bridge programs, both qualitatively and quantitatively. We're studying undergraduate student success in STEM. We're studying doctoral student socialization, and we're studying faculty socialization. So like what keeps faculty engaged, and particularly minoritized faculty on the post-secondary level. And so I'd be happy to talk about any and all of that a little bit later. But the theoretical foundations that really connect my work on mentoring and belonging have a lot to do with this psychosocial development trajectory. And so when we're dealing with undergrads, usually they're what Erik Erikson would refer to as in emerging adulthood. It means they're not quite where they want to be just yet, and they're not quite past a lot of the issues that come from adolescence and the transition. And so part of what we need and part of what is valuable when students get to college is having role models, have people that they can connect to in a meaningful way that are giving them the confidence that they can do what they need to do. And so that's where the social cognitive theory piece comes in. Albert Bandura's work in psychology, there's a really foundational and fundamental construct called self-efficacy. And self-efficacy in general is this idea that somebody has confidence that they can do the things necessary to be successful in certain domains of behavior. And so when we talk about self-efficacy, there's academic self-efficacy, which is well studied, but there's efficacy that's studied pretty broadly across the board. We tend to be most interested not only in self-efficacy as a construct worth investigating, but also the fact that a lot of what gives people positive efficacy information, that is confidence that they can do what's necessary for them to be successful in the spaces that they care to be successful in, whether it be at school, whether it be at work, or any of the spheres that are related to that, is socially situated. You know, your ability to have role models that are offering you encouraging words, the opportunities that are provided to you to demonstrate to yourself that you can be successful at things. That usually requires a mentor. It usually requires a sponsor. It usually requires somebody that you feel like understands you and sees you and can facilitate the type of opportunities for you to develop your skills. And then kind of finally, for me, where a lot of my core ideas are coming from now are the bridges between college and the workforce, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level, and thinking about mentoring and belonging with more of a career development perspective. And so career development theory really kind of posits mentoring as a twofold thing. One, it's about psychosocial support. So the people who see you, recognize you, acknowledge you, let you know that you can do it, let you know that they appreciate you. So when we started this morning, I clicked on the link and I was named Brittany Whitley when I started here. And I think that that's a really interesting kind of tie. It's like, oh, this is somebody who cares about me and sees my work and is providing an opportunity for me to share it with a larger group of people. And the other piece is this career support. And so somebody can't really be considered a mentor. And I feel like one of the problems with mentor as a concept is that a real mentor is providing psychosocial and career support. There's no such thing as a bad mentor. And if we're agreeing on the foundational definition of a mentor, you need both the exposure and the opportunities related to career. And I want us to think about career more broadly, not just career as in what you do after you have your degree, but career as an academic career. A senior student who's a chemistry major has a lot to offer a first-year chemistry major student. And so whether it's kind of confined to your academic career or it's expanded to the workforce, there are a lot of opportunities that can be created. So the belonging piece of this, I really situate this in kind of a social psychological approach to student service and kind of student success. And so most of you are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It gets applied in so many different ways. And I'm really interested in kind of this yellow-orange area for the most part. Some of that requires that, whether we're talking about the scholarships, we're talking about the connections between family, in order for us to move. And there's a lot of controversy about whether it is actually hierarchical, because all of these needs can arise and have prominence at any given time. But the situation and focus on the love and belonging needs is that it opens up opportunities for students to self-actualize. So when you get to campus, when we talk about attrition, for example, in STEM majors, which I think is one of the things that's interestingly connects all of our work, part of the reason that people opt out of STEM or that they change majors is because they don't feel like they belong. They haven't developed the self-esteem. They don't have the mentors. They don't have people that are reassuring them that they can do it, and that they can take care of themselves and create a career and see people who look like them on the other side of things. And so this idea of persistent and caring, consistent interactions is really powerful. And it's also something that we should be thinking about because of the situation we find ourselves in right now. There's a lot of belonging work in evolutionary biology that talks about the importance of actually meeting in person. So getting to see people face to face, maintaining close friendships. And because so much of what we're doing right now is computer mediated, like there's probably going to be, and there needs to be additional research that talks about, are we able to feel like we belong? Are we able to feel connected to organizations in the same way when we don't get to show up in the classrooms, when we don't get to hang out with each other, when we don't get to go have coffee together? So why study these things? I'm convinced, and so though my work is founded in higher education student success, I have become more and more convinced that mentoring and belonging are organizational imperatives no matter where you show up. So if you're in politics, if you're in education, if you're at any type of organization, it could be tech, it could be drilling for oil, all of these things are valuable. And so when I say, social isolation and alienation increase educational risk, really, I think they increase career risk. People risk feeling disengaged. They risk feeling like they're not a part of an organization and that they're not making the highest level of contribution if they don't feel like they belong and if they don't have mentors. We know that belonging and being mentored can impact motivational schema. And so those of you who are those are unnecessarily complicated ways of saying that when you have somebody that looks out for you, you're more likely to do things. So if we think of our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors being linked, when we feel like our work is appreciated, when we have people that are supporting us and advocating for us, we're more likely to want to do more work. And so in both an educational and a career context, these ideas of creating these supportive networks of people who care about you, having people who are willing to engage with your work. Even me, I benefit because one of my mentors is on this call. Dr. Kurz is my assigned faculty mentor when I got to University of Missouri. And even though we study similar topics, but in completely different ways, I'm a social psychologist, he's an economist. I can come to him, and you saw his beautiful tables in his earlier presentation. I'm like, hey, I got to revise, resubmit. Can you look at my table? What's wrong? And he's like, oh, just do this, this, and this. and now I'm off to the races. And not only is mentoring and belonging connected to this idea of engagement, the fact that you can create avenues for social connection, it's really still poorly understood. We don't understand what makes people belong. We don't understand the role of intersectional identities in helping people feel connected to college campuses. We know a lot about the history of college campuses. We know a lot about the social political environment that we find ourselves in right now, but this is still generally understudied. And so I'll move a little bit faster just because I recognize we have time and I want to make time for questions. But one of the things that we're starting to explore a little bit more, especially in post-secondary education context, is this idea that mentoring and belonging are duplex ideas. And one of the things that's understudied is that mentors benefit a great deal. And so somebody that feels like they can give back to an organization, somebody that feels like they can create the next generation of themselves, they're more likely to be connected. They're more likely to continue to stay on the cutting edge of what they need to do from a research and scholarship standpoint. They're more likely to know and maintain the positive social connections within and across organizations. And so like this idea that mentors benefit from mentoring and that mentors need to feel like they belong, not only because of what they're asked to do, but also because how can you make somebody else feel like a member of an organization, or how can you promote belonging for people that are your junior if you don't feel like you belong to the organization yourself? So paying a little bit closer attention to how a lot of this stuff manifests at multiple levels. Everybody wants reduced role conflict. Everybody wants networks. Everybody wants opportunities to continue to grow and develop. And so the provision of these, not just for mentees, but also for mentors, is something that's really important and emerging. And then part of what we find right now is there are so many different ways that people can get disconnected when it comes to creating avenues for success for all members of an organization. And again, I think that part of the issue is that we create these languages, and even I'm guilty of it to a certain extent with the naming of this presentation. Mentoring and belonging isn't just important for minoritized students, it's important for all students. Everybody needs to feel like they're seen and they're part of the larger conversation, that they're included in decisions, that their opinion matters. And so some of the major issues that we see, especially with the equity gaps and the disjunction in the number of people that go to college, so for example, within the Black community, Black women attend undergraduate education at 2 times the rate of Black men. So 2/3 of African Americans in college are Black women, 1/3 are Black men. And these issues that we see with culture, race, and racism, these difficult conversations that people feel unprepared to have, or that they're otherwise finding difficult to engage with, that people are identifying as gaps, but nobody's really doing the training and support to overcome them. Even some of the attributions that we make, so culture. I come from a family, I was raised by a single mother. My mother was a registered nurse. She worked 2.5 to 3 jobs pretty much all of the time that I can remember. And so I know that has cultural echoes in how I think about hard work. If I'm like, oh man, I have to stay up late and continue to write. I'm like, my mom was working 3-4 shifts. She would have put in 58 hours by Wednesday. And recognizing the way that influences the way that we mentor, recognizing the way that it influences the way we show up for our students, and continue to think critically about that and what it means and what kind of messages it sends. The other thing is this idea of evolution, and that sometimes things that prevent students from participating and reaching their full potential are these aspiration gaps, because they haven't had somebody suggest that, hey, you can do this and I believe in you and I think that you would be great. And the skill gaps are less critical because we're in a learning organization. If we can get people to aspire to these greater levels of achievement, then we can help to close the gaps. So in general, I want us to think, and I show this not to expand on it too much, but that mentoring, belonging, it's an ecological systems perspective on it, that, if the mentee is at the center, we need that primary set of mentors. We need the people that are directly connected to them, whether it's through outreach and support programs, whether it's through retention programs, whether it's the faculty that they're interacting with. And the same goes for people who are in their career. Like, what is your direct supervisor doing to support you? We need to do a better job of educating the family, but also, if we're thinking about Missouri as an example of this, like, what are we saying in terms of the mentoring culture and the belonging culture at the entire university? Recognizing that a student who shows up is going to be within a department, is going to be within a major, is going to be within a college, and how are we making sure that they feel connected to important others throughout those spaces? And so best practices, strategies, I could go on forever about things that we're pushing on and trying to think about. Been doing a lot more with the psychology of persuasion and negotiation, trying to help people open their minds about understanding intersectionality. Part of it is recognizing the role of intersectionality as an invitation for people. So a lot of times people get silenced when it comes to talking about race, gender, ethnicity, intersectional identity, and college student success. And sometimes that silencing comes because people have been told either implicitly or explicitly that their opinions don't matter. So one of the first things that I like to do, especially with my white male students, have been a really amazing opportunity for me to push on these ideas at Mizzou, where it's, you have something to say, you don't get to be quiet. You don't get the privilege of stepping away from this, because we need everybody, and you have an intersectional identity too. Everybody has a unique background, everybody has a unique culture, everybody has ideas about work and success. And when we make them explicit, we have a lot more opportunity to change minds and push people to think differently. Manifesting diversity, promoting attitudes and behaviors is really about making sure that it's incorporated everywhere. And so one of the things that's valuable to me is hearing how, the two doctors' presentations before are really connected to this idea. There are so many different ways to care about diversity. There are so many different ways to approach equity that we need to recognize and shine light on all of them. Recognizing that enhancing cross-cultural competence is an ongoing issue, and that even I'm a diversity scholar. I still learn something new every time I teach. I still learn something new every time I pick something up to read. Recognizing that it's an ongoing issue and that nobody's ever going to get there, but we can all walk on the journey together. And then just need to train stakeholders at multiple levels. It isn't enough to try to promote belonging and mentoring at one level. It's not about one-to-one relationships. It's about individual relationships, departmental relationships, college relationships, entire university relationships. And the fact that if we're not training people to do mentoring well, if we're not teaching people what these words mean, then they fall into this unfortunate kind of buzzword space. So a lot of people have heard belonging, a lot of people have heard mentoring, but they don't actually know what those words mean. And because we're not explicit about what they mean and how they manifest themselves, it's difficult to translate that into policy and praxis that actually moves the needle for minoritized students. And so as the NSF, the NIH, and all these other federal organizations continue to pour money into global competitiveness and closing the equity gap, part of what we require is more clear understanding of, like, what are the foundational ideas that we're pushing on, and like, how should we be going about it? And we can't work towards consistent solutions if we're not defining the problems the same way. So with that, I will end. And this is my research team and a way too big picture of me, and welcome your questions.
All right. Well, thank you all so much. I think that all three of those talks were fantastic. I've spoken with all of you offline, and even I'm taking notes, learning a lot. So I appreciate everything that you have to offer. So we do have time for some questions. So if you're one of our guests, please feel free to type in a question into the Q&A or the chat. Laura Winter has a couple questions in here. I'm going to ask one here, and if our panelists also want to take a look at some of these, if they can answer them in the chat, that would also be great. But I want to address Laura's first question here, which is looking at the Bright Flight scholarship. And so she asks, if Bright Flight is inequitable because it's based on the ACT test, then isn't the finding that receipt of Bright Flight leads to greater employment in Missouri a finding that we're perpetuating equity gaps into the workforce, essentially a white and wealth privilege effect versus a scholarship impact? And so I'd really like to, I think it most directly relates to Dr. Kerr's presentation, but also use this opportunity to talk about how barriers to access in higher education can translate into inequities in the workforce and later in life earning. So I guess we can start off with Dr. Kurz, and then both of our other panelists are welcome to jump in as well.
Sure. So just a quick bit of more information on that study. So we looked at, it's essentially what's the effect of being eligible for the Bright Flight. So hitting that criteria of 30 or 31 on the ACT, and then what are those students more likely to be employed 8 years later? And so the mechanisms that could cause that change could be, one, it made them more likely to go to college in Missouri, made them more likely to go to college or stay in Missouri for college, and then more or less likely to come back and work within the state of Missouri. And so the design allows us to say that I'm pretty confident that it is due to the scholarship impact that increase the likelihood of these students working in Missouri 8 years later. We can't say whether they're working broadly across the country, given the data limitations, but we know that it induced them to be more likely to be working in Missouri. But what I think does play out of it is the students that are likely to be induced to be more likely to work in Missouri are more likely to be white and high income students, just given who is eligible for that award. It's, as we showed, there's a pretty large gap across both income and race in who becomes eligible for that award. And so I think it's not that it's a white or a privilege effect that we're seeing because of that is causing the employment gap, but I would say the beneficiaries of that award or the beneficiaries of that increased employment effect are much more likely to be white and upper to middle income students. And so they're the students that are benefiting it. And so it may be, we can't rule out the fact that the low income students are more likely to leave the state. I think that's less likely the effect. I think it's more that this scholarship gave opportunity, and it's giving opportunity to those that are already privileged.
Dr. Gurantz or Dr. Williams, anything to add there, thinking about inequities in higher education kind of bleeding over into workforce inequities in the future?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's interesting, and I had a similar question when I was listening to Brad's. I was like, I wonder if the retention issue is because they've already developed like kind of some kind of stickiness to college. And so even if they are no longer meeting the GPA requirements, they have either a network of people that are interested, or like they've figured out, hey, I can do this. This was a blip. And so I would be interested in kind of what are the psychological factors that are related to when you lose funding. You know, have you developed the relationships that give you other avenues for continuing to support and continue to move forward with your degree? I also think in my own kind of qualitative work, one of the things that's been interesting is students who've been stripped of scholarships, because I've had a couple of different data sets. It's a wake-up call for them, and it actually redoubles their effort. Like they pay more attention to their academic success. And so I would wonder too if that's what's going on there to a certain extent. Like, oh, I lost my scholarship. Well, now I got to get it together. I need to pay a lot more attention because I'm costing myself money.
Yeah, I'll just make two quick notes. One is in some other research, there is other research about students who've lost their scholarships, and that's unfortunately found much more negative effects than what's seen in Brad's paper. And so I do think what they show is that there is a double-edged sword. For some students, they redouble their efforts. And then for some students, it's really demoralizing. And of course, this is like economic research, so they don't get into all the sort of factors of the connections and mentorship and other things that might moderate those things. But what they do find is that probably the negative effects, at least in their study, outweigh the positive effects. There's just much more students negatively demoralized than there are the ones who sort of redouble their efforts. So in one study, they found that the sort of academic probation has like this net negative effect on students' long-term wages and participation in the labor force and things like that. I'll stop there.
The second question, I was just starting to type out an answer that's related to this sort of losing the financial aid and what's going on. So when we did study the losing the aid after the first year of the GPA, the time frame was 2009 to 2014. We're stuck at the top end because of some data issues and connecting with the institutions and being able to identify where the students are at. But I think you're exactly right. At this time, Missouri Access or Access Missouri was very volatile and waiting on sort of the state government to fund it, which would happen in June. And so that students would get changes of their financial aid awards very late. And so that those numbers were fluctuating quite a bit as they were coming in. And oftentimes, sometimes the aid awards would change even after they've started the next fall semester, and then they'd sort of suddenly lose. So the uncertainty of whether they've lost it or not, or how much they were receiving if they retained it, I think caused some of the issues to probably show not much is going on. The other side is oftentimes they were very low awards because they were reduced. And so you're talking $800-900 sometimes, as opposed to the $1,200 or $1,500. And then this is a working paper. We found nothing. And so we're trying to figure out how can we study the mechanisms of why that may be the case. And as we've talked with the financial aid officers, exactly what you said, oftentimes they're able to find other ways to shore up that lost award through institutional finances, or the students are still relying on debt to finance it. But most of the research shows that once they've started in, they do have a lot more momentum in finishing, and that the effects of financial aid changes affect the students much less after they've started and been moving forward than sort of on that very front end of when they're choosing to go or not. As was said, typically we see sort of a negative effect. We were not excited. We were very surprised to see sort of no effect, and in a pretty, closely estimated sort of zero effect, that now we're trying to figure out why that's the case.
I do think across research, we do find that the jump from high school to college is just a huge transition. There's so many things that they need to do to be successful to make that jump. But once they are in college, for a lot of students, they don't think of themselves as like college going material. And once they can go there, and especially when you have these sort of like promise programs, these other ways to make it in essence free for them, it's like insurance, right? So they can try something that they're uncertain of whether they're going to be successful or not, but they can try it at a really low cost. And then a lot of students go there and realize that they are capable of succeeding in the college environment, particularly if they're motivated and they're, connected to resources and really like enjoying the material that they're learning, which is very different. And so a lot of it is getting them to make that transition. And then once they're there, we do find that sometimes these things that we think of as big deals and we don't want to hurt our students, but that losing aid or what have you does not always lead to them then necessarily dropping out. Because once they've made that really big leap, now there's that stickiness, as you said.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because that dovetails really well with the work that we're doing on college outreach and academic success programs that focus on the transition. And so summer bridge programs, one of the best things, especially those that are credit bearing, is you're giving students directly from when they graduate from high school an opportunity to show and demonstrate to themselves oftentimes that they're capable of doing college level work, in addition to creating the kind of mentoring networks that they need to continue to be successful. So connecting them with faculty members before college starts, peers that are starting at the same time as they are, giving them an opportunity to think differently about major, and having those, like creating those networks of supports so that students can start to envision themselves and like see themselves and change their identity from high school student to college students. One of the things that we found is kind of creating that stickiness too.
Fantastic. I wish that we had hours and hours to just sit and talk about this because I could really listen to it forever. But I think in respect of everyone's time, I'd like to end kind of on a question, just thinking about higher education policy in Missouri. And so when we're thinking about the transition to college, financial aid, and the experience of students in college, if each of you kind of want to close thinking of kind of one or two policies that you think could maybe be most effective, either at the state level or the institutional level at kind of reducing some of these barriers. I know this is really hard in research because we're usually saying this will have some effects, on this thing, but without going going too crazy, just kind of maybe a couple takeaways for how the work that you've talked about today can really relate to some of the policy decisions that our lawmakers and our institutions are trying to make right now.
I'll go first because I have the least to say, and then I'll give the other panelists a second to come up with their brilliant answers. So I'm a relatively recent transplant to Missouri, and unfortunately, a lot of my work is really involved in California, where I'm from, because I have relationships with the state agencies there. So I don't know enough about what Missouri is currently doing to really speak well to sort of what their challenges might be. But I will say a broad point, which is I think states are, and I don't mean this about Missouri in particular, but states in general, I find are less willing than they should be to see what other states are doing successfully and adopt their practices. I feel like one theme when I've presented to large groups is this idea that our state is very idiosyncratic and only we understand the challenges that our state faces. And I actually think some of those challenges are much more universal than they give them credit for. Like, we're all humans and we all do human things. And so I just always encourage states to look more carefully at other states and think about adopting things, even if not necessarily, like, it doesn't always sit as well with you as you might think based on your own knowledge of the situation. Like, local knowledge is important, but also seeing what other states have done and drawing the lessons from that, I think, is really important too.
Yeah, I think I look across the financial aid programs in Missouri, and the questions came up. We are often sort of underfunding them, even sort of based on statute. So we'll say, this is how much we should be funding them, but we don't have enough money. And so all three of our major financial aid programs often get sort of shortchanged, and they're all being funded, but none of them are effective enough because they're sort of, each of them is underfunded relative to what they could possibly be doing. I think in the past, there's been a lot of debates sort of around the A+ program and making sure and thinking about going universal with it, thinking about whether maybe the first 2 years could also sort of help fund it four-year institutions. And I think there's a lot of good in the A+ program in particular, because it does give the students the knowledge that I can't afford college early on. It gives them some of the work that they can do to during high school to get prepared, as opposed to even a needs-based program like Access Missouri, which goes on Pell funding. It's very difficult to know whether you're going to get that award. And so it's less motivating to students early on in their careers to get ready for college. And so I would say, think about ways to sort of fund A+ in particular, sort of more broadly, and open up access to the institutions to make that sort of a little bit more effective program, and find ways to sort of either fund it more or sort of think about consolidation across programs to make a program much more effective rather than three mildly effective programs.
Yeah, I would stay on the theme of collaboration and funding. And so for me, one of the things that I found, no matter what constituency you're working with, a lot of the issues come back to this idea that it takes money and it takes resources, whether they be human, fiscal, et cetera, to do good work. And oftentimes programs are either shutting down or they can't execute in the way that they want because they haven't been able to draw the connections and get the kind of appropriate funding. And so I feel like, to me, part of the importance of this, and even the form that we're in right now, is continuing to connect policymakers and scholars that approach these problems in different ways to show how interconnected the issues that we're really all facing are, and put more brainpower, put more effort, put more perspective on solving these problems together. I think one of the interesting things that I found in having the opportunity to socialize doctoral students is everybody doesn't come to you and want to be a faculty member too. And so what does that create? I need to know more about what are the policy opportunities for my students after they graduate? What are the administrative opportunities for my students after they graduate? I think some of the best and most interesting ideas that we've generated and that we've had the opportunity to study have come from understanding different ways that people approach the same problems that we're working on. And so creating more venues like this, creating more opportunities for collaboration, creating more space for scholars to understand exactly what state policymakers are thinking about so that we can address our work to that, and continue to, it sounds hokey sometimes. And I remember when I was first a graduate student, you hear people all the way to time talking about, we have to bridge theory and practice. We have to bridge theory and practice, but like actually doing it, like let's actually bridge theory and practice. Let's create the type of collaborative networks where I could see a policy being mentored by Brad, being mentored by me. I could see myself being mentored by people like, hey, what do you need to know so that you can make better policy decisions? Let us go investigate that and make sure that we're doing that translational work.
All right, thank you all so much. I think that's a really great place to end on, and I'll turn it over to Rachel for any closing thoughts. Again, thank you all for coming and listening today, and to our panelists. I really appreciate your expertise and for getting up with us early this morning.
I won't keep anyone too much longer. I really loved the answers to those questions. That last question, it answered a lot of the questions that I had written down. So I think it was a great question to end with. I just wanted to thank you all again, and also give a quick reminder. We have another briefing that will be coming up exactly 1 month from now on March 10th. Our fellow who covers agriculture, natural resources, and economic development is facilitating that, Dr. Eleni Bickel, and it will be focused on farmer behavioral and mental health, which is a real pressing issue in rural communities around Missouri right now. And so we hope to see you back then, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good one.
Thank you.